let's give Frank the floor. Frank, if you can unmute yourself. So Frank Racicot, he's a prospector and geologist. He's coming from a family of many prospectors and geologists over the last 120 years, I think, here in the Sudbury area. And he's worked for many junior companies all over Canada and most provinces and territories. And his passion is also doing short videos about prospecting, and so he's got a few videos that also earn prizes here in Cinefest here in Sudbury. So welcome, Frank. If you can unmute yourself and then share your screen and give us your tips on prospecting. I think you're out in the field right now as well, applying your skills. So give us some fresh stories as well.
Yeah, right now I'm up in this Nunavut doing some prospecting. So something I've been doing for the past 30, 40 years. Anyway, I just wanted to give some tips on that I've learned over a few years myself or other people. Just start off saying prospectors have been around for hundreds of thousands of years. You know, someone had to find all the chert or obsidian for all the flints and spear tips over the thousands of years. I've even heard and seen pictures of spear tips and arrow tips made from copper, probably that derived from either Saskatchewan or Michigan. So, like I say, prospectors have been around for a long time. First tip is to be observant, and it's better to just always take your time. Most of the rocks we're looking for are over 2 billion years old. They're not going anywhere anyway. Give you an example. What does this sign say? Check it out. It says, most people think it says, I love pears in the springtime. But if you look closely, it says, I love pears in the springtime. A lot of people get fooled, myself included. It's just an example of how we have to be observant in the field and at all times. Another example of how it's important is to be observant. You can probably tell which way this vehicle was traveling. Was it going from the sidewalk to the left or coming from the left to the right? It's obvious it was going from the left to the right and pulling out just by the way the water droplets are coming from the back of probably the back of a truck or something. Anyway, so be observant is number one. Tip number two is break rock, break rock, break rock. And there's different styles of hammer. You can use a regular prospector's pick on the left. I use what I call the platinum or palladium pounder. It's a 3 or 4 pound sledge. I've welded a piece of hard grater blade steel on the back, and it's good for breaking rock and for stripping. There's different guys. People like different size hammers, different weights hammers. You can try different long ones. I've made these ones on the right hand side myself. I tried one of the long ones. It's a 3-foot handle. Some guys like it because if you're a tall guy and you're out in the open. I tried today and I found it was too long to swing when you're close to outcrops and you're surrounded by trees. So I like either the 18-inch or the 24-inch handle. Tip number 3 is strip outcrops. You've got to get around and get on and check out the outcrops, and you've got to cut the moss and strip the outcrops in order to expose it, peel the moss back. And there's many showings have been found and quartz veins have been found by myself just by stripping the rocks. Some of the stripping tools, you can either use a geo tool on the right or a typical grub hoe, but that's why I like my palladium pounder because it functions as both. It'll cut the roots and the moss, and it'll also break the rock. Tip number 4 is overturned trees can be very helpful. The advantage of an overturned tree, it's a recent exposure and you don't have to fight and dig out all the roots and all the dirt. And like I say, I'd walk 50 miles, so check out an overturned tree. One little tip I'd suggest if you're doing that in a new area, tie a flag beside the overturned tree if you've checked it out. because sometimes when I was working in Long Lac, I'd be coming from different directions. I'd check with the same tree, the same overturned tree, 2 or 3 times. So, and I did find showings by going and that I sampled by going checking overturned trees. There's another big overturned tree, and it saves you a lot of digging and rooting around. Tip number 5 is nature can help. When you're crossing a beaver pond, check out the rocks on the beaver pond. Just about every beaver pond I've seen, is some more so than others, will have rocks on them. It's amazing how big and heavy those a beaver can carry put on his dam. The stock photo on the one on the left is a stock photo, with the one on the right, there's some rocks there that are carried by beaver. Here's another dam up near Agnew Lake with a bunch of rocks on it. And I was told by a couple of years ago at the Prospectors Convention by a Newfoundland geologist or prospector, he was crossing a beaver dam and he found some quartz with VG in it. So they can help. Tip number 6 is traverse across the strike. I have lots of young guys or prospectors I know helping out or starting out. They'll wander all over the place, not realizing or taking into account the strike of the rocks. If you prospect across strike, you're more likely to cross some zones of interest. And here's another little cartoon of what would happen if you're going on strike and prospecting. This the, in red and yellow, you can see the zones of interest and the gold zones and structures. This is from Wesstone's operation up near west of Wawa at the down at the Eagle River mine area. And interesting that slide I showed you where she had to go showed a little cartoon arrow going across strike. This here, one of these zones here, their new zone, their number 7 zone, was actually located based on underground drilling. They didn't find it through from the surface prospecting. And on the right hand side, there's a guy there standing on the new number 7 zone, which is one of their mining zones. They found it, they stripped it after they realized where it was based on underground drilling, and they did a surface projection of it. And you can tell the overburden doesn't look very deep there. So I'm kind of guessing that maybe indeed the people who prospected the area originally may have not crossed that zone, or if they crossed it, they didn't realize what it was. So it's good, just remember prospect across strike. And related to that one kind of is just using examples in nature as a model, like flexures or bends in the porphyry was probably caused, where the zones were probably caused by a bend or curve in it, just like you see a curve in a sidewalk or fractured ice, it'll open up and make openings. Tip number 7 is don't have blinders on. Voisey's Bay, they were looking for diamonds and they found nickel. And the Ring of Fire, De Beers, was originally looking for diamonds, and they found some sulphides showing, which they passed on to a junior company, which drilled it and eventually became the Ring of Fire. So have an open mind. Don't rule out any commodity when you're in the field. Tip number 8, especially useful near Agnew Lake and East Bow Lake area, and especially around Sudbury when I was looking for PGs, is to turn over rocks. Besides breaking rock, but turn over rocks, because oftentimes for PGs you don't need very many sulphides, maybe 1% or even 0.5% sulphides, and oftentimes on the weathered surface you won't see the rust. So if you turn the rocks over, you'll see the rusty spots. In Agnew Lake, here's another example of some rusty spots and some chalcopyrite. My partner and I, about 15, 20 years ago, found something called Platinum Hill, which it only had 0.5% chalcopyrite, but it had 15 grams palladium, or platinum actually. And remember to break rock, and break rock. Tip number 9, dogs can be used to sniff for cancer drugs in people, all kinds of things. You can also use them for sulphides. They use it quite a bit, especially in Finland and Sweden. So if you want more details on specifics how to do that, check with maybe some places in those countries. Um, but what I've heard, one of the things they do for the dogs who look for sulphides is the handlers, if the dog doesn't find any sulphides after a few days, they'll actually bury something so the dog can find it and realize he's doing a good job. Otherwise, the dog becomes depressed or neurotic, probably like us prospectors, if you don't find any showings after a while. It's pretty frustrating to go out all day and get skunked and not come back with any samples. It's happened a few times, but um, it's frustrating when it does happen. Tip number 10 is think outside the box. Here's an example. An old flux gauge magnetometer is probably 30 or 40 years old, or who knows how old that is. Everything's all digital now, but the flux gauge magnetometer just measures the mag's values directly below your feet. And in 1990s, early 1990s, I used a flux gauge magnetometer. There's something on the left that predates the mag, the old dip needles. That's they work quite well as well. It's almost like a flux gauge magnetometer. But I used a flux gauge magnetometer in the 1990s, looking for diamonds and Lamprey dikes. And I was hired up then to prospect, and I used the flux gauge magnetometer, and I actually found 24 Lamprey dikes. I learned how to dig a 6-foot hole with a 4-foot shovel. And you can also use I've also used the flux gauge magnetometer in the winter to ground truth heating anomalies. Getting back to the Wawa example where I found all those Lamprey dikes, actually there was 5 Lamprey dikes came emanating from a circular structure as well. When in Wawa, I'd walk along a gut, usually there were northeast guts or depressions. I'd go for about half an hour with my magnetometer, and I'd flag all the highest values. Wherever the highest value was, I would dig down. And after I went through all the different horizons of soil, the A and the B horizon, I'd come across a black magnetic micaceous soil, which was actually a decomposed lamprey, and we'd send that in for sample. Tip number 11 is consider using VLF surveys. Sean Perron out of Batchawana, he's got an algorithm. I think him and his professor from Portugal have developed. It enables him to interpret, not see, but interpret down to depths of 147 meters. He claims the results comparable to IP. I call it poor man's IP. There's an example of one of his profiles that he did, and we used and we drilled, and it hit the target, and he's had quite a good success. But I would say don't believe him and don't believe me. If anybody ever wants to do it, give them a blind test with a bunch of data, and especially if you know where it's a drill hole and you know what the results are, give them a blind test and see what he comes up with. Tip number 12: beep mats. I've used them in the past. And people might want to consider using them again. I think they'd probably work when you watch those shows for prospecting for nuggets and using metal detectors in Australia. You think some of those guys would use a beep mat to find an area where there might be more potential nuggets before they're doing it, and it'd be a lot faster than their little metal detectors. Also, a friend of mine, he was chasing a big quartz vein in Timmins, and he used the beep mat to find where the areas weren't magnetic. And he defined his quartz zone. He had the excavator dig it up, and sure enough, under about 12 feet of overburden, he found his big quartz vein. Speaking of quartz veins, tip 13 is just note the style, shape, size, and frequency of quartz veins. Now, there's lots of different types of veins, ladder veins and gash veins and link veins. I'm not really going to go into that. That's that's a specialty of its own probably. But I just look when you're in the field doing some recon prospecting. Pay attention to maybe the size and the shape of the vein. That'd be one thing you might want to consider. Also, the frequency and the width of the quartz veins. Check that out. I would say in general, they increase in size and or in frequency as you approach your zone of interest. And although that's not always the case, because this here is from a property I was visiting, working up last fall up in northwestern Ontario. and some of the bigger veins are actually a little bit further away from the shaft. But in the general area, you can see lots of action going on with lots of quartz veins, different sizes. They're boudinage. So if this is an area has been stripped, but if you're just prospecting, you can only see parts of the exposure. You should have an idea that you're getting close in general to something of interest. And here's the actual head frame um, or the shaft of the old original mine. And on the right hand side, there's some of the core shack. Oh, sorry, there's some of the core and some of the quartz veins. Although, so like I say, things don't always go exactly the way because Mother Nature will have her own rules. Speaking of veins, um, when I was visited the hard gold sugar zone, I was going downstairs down on the ramp, and just before they got to their main zone of interest, there was a whole bunch of epidode veins. The epidode veins increased, and there's a whole bunch just before them for the zone of interest. And I thought that would be a really good experiment and little thesis or project to analyze the epidode veins to see if there's a change in the iron or magnesium or some sort of mineral content as you approach the veins, as you approach the zone of interest. This way, if there was, if you could use that knowledge in another area, especially if, say, there was limited exposure, if you came across a series of epidode veins and you analyzed some of them, you could know whether you would go either north or south, or at least in what direction where it might be something of interest. And just when you think you have all things figured out, Mother Nature tries to prove you wrong. We think we're so smart sometimes, but we're not. Now, pyrite is normally cubic, but this piece of core makes you wonder about that. So you always got to be thinking and wondering what's going on. And remember, break rock, and break rock. The rest of this prospecting talk, or the second half, is recorded on July 26th up in Wawa. There was some sort of technical error, so I had to finish recording it later date. Anyway, tip number 14, when you see something different, slow down, take off your pack sack. Don't forget to GPS it and flag it. One time I took off my pack sack and spent over an hour looking for it after. I got distracted by chasing down some showings or some other rock types, who knows. Anyway, if you see something different, either different topography or different rock types, different plants, or excessive dead trees, or overturned trees, or whatever, you slow down, take your pack sack off, and check it out. There's usually a reason, and oftentimes it'll be have a showing or be of interest to you. So trust your gut or subconscious and check out something if you see something different. Tip number 15: understand how plants can help you prospect. I have some examples. For instance, up in New Liskeard area, according to Mike Stuart Hamilton, the OGS geochemist, he found hundreds, if not thousands, of lady slippers growing over top the kimberlite. Obviously, there's something that enhances their growth, and that makes them want to grow there, and that helps. Once you know that, it can possibly help you find other kimberlites there or in other areas. Another plant that's quite helpful in prospecting is something called zinc moss up in the Yukon or BC. They'll have something called zinc moss wherever there's areas, certain rocks that have lots of zinc. It's a very distinct light lime green. There's regular moss on the right hand side and zinc moss on the left. And according to Ed Debicki, when he was prospecting there several decades ago, exploring for zinc, he had some of the zinc moss assayed, and it ran as high as 4% zinc. Certain plants are chalcophile. That means they love calcium. They could be indicators of carbonate zones or carbonatites. Some plants that are chalcophile are poison ivy, leeks, maidenhair ferns, etc. An example specifically is where they can be used is the old Ackerman gold mine in southern Ontario. The Ackerman mine is within some siliceous sediments, and within those siliceous sediments, there's a bunch of quartz anchorite veins, And poison ivy is oftentimes associated with those quartz anchorite veins. There's some more information on the Ackerman mine gold mine at the bottom, and a link about some other poison ivy and chalcophile plants up top. Also in southern Ontario, two prospectors, Mark and Sandra Branham, they've noticed that they use chalcophile plants to love their calcite-rich zones on their property, and they've used plants such as wild leeks and the maidenhair ferns to locate those zones. You can read about that in this article in a bit more detail. Mike Easton of the Ontario Geological Survey has a couple articles about how helpful lichens can be, and I really liken the articles quite a bit. Mike mentions how some lichens in Finland on serpentine contain high nickel. He also mentions how some lichens elsewhere have high values in molybdenum, rare earths, or even uranium. He documents how some lichens change from pale to dark green over copper deposits. And some lichens prefer or don't prefer certain rock types. On the left-hand side, you can see a photo of a little dike that does not have lichens growing on it. And that was taken from behind the Carmichael Arena in Sudbury. Personal experience mentioned to me by Prospector Mike Tremblay, who's a really good prospector. When he was up in Yellowknife in the 80s, I think it was, prospecting, 80s or 90s, they noticed that whenever they stopped for lunch, they'd see these orange lichens, and so in long cracks. So they broke them open, and just about every time they'd find chalcophile in the cracks. And according to other research I've done, and I think Mike Easton's paper as well, some of these orange lichens are chalcophile. They have an affinity for copper. So Mike's observation up in Nunavut jives with Mike Easton's documented thing on lichens and copper. Regarding plants, so if you see something different or unusual, just ask yourself why. I have a couple examples that I don't have any photos for. For instance, up in Wawa, where I am now, about 30 years ago, I was visiting the fire sands carbonatite, and I noticed that all the plants there, the shrubs and the trees, grew excessively more, and they looked different. And so, without even realizing if there's a carbonatite, if you see the plants growing different, there's a reason. I've heard of cranberries growing up away from wet bogs where they normally grow, up in elevated areas, where in old pits. Also in old pits, I've heard of examples where a prospector was looking at a whole bunch of showings, and they were finding these old pits and old showings, and his helper, or his buddy who wasn't even a prospector, said, "Why are all these cedar trees here lined up in a row?" And sure enough, all the old pits and showings had excess water, and cedar trees were growing in these old pits, so they can be helpful. Up in Timmins, when I was over 20 years ago, my friends and I were staking some circular structures for possible diamonds in a pipe, and it turns out that these circular structures were there for a reason. Oftentimes the trees were dead in the area, and when I checked it out when I was in the field staking, I oftentimes noticed some sort of white caliche or precipitate attached to the dead tree roots. Stuart Hamilton of the OGS has done a whole bunch of research as to different reasons why these circular structures occur, and you can check that out as well with the OGS. Tip number 16 is a simple way to describe the percentage of sulphides. Rather than trying to estimate the percentage of each sulphide, I'll give an overall range of sulphides in a rock, and then use ratios as a way of describing the different proportions of different sulphides. So I find this way a handy little trick to record sulphides, or you could probably use it for other minerals if you're looking for certain minerals. Tip 17 is to use all senses. For instance, the sense of smell. if you smell sulfur when you bang rocks, it's because there's pyrite there. And this would be especially helpful if you see fine pyrite, or you can't see the fine pyrite, which might go unnoticed. But if you smell the sulfur, that means there's sulfides are there. Arsenopyrite, when you break it, it will smell like garlic. Use your hearing. Silicified rocks will have a higher pitch, and they're also noticeably harder to break, but they'll have a higher pitch as well. I've walked on silicified scree. It'll actually sound clinky and even spark at night. Use the sense of feel. I've heard one prospector who would find he could feel angular rocks under his rubber boots that were sitting on rock or moss and indicated rubble from a nearby pit. And if you also see or feel angular rocks sitting on moss or outcrop, you probably, it's likely caused because there was a blast from a pit nearby. Another sense is always use common sense. Be safe. And try and link your eyes with our brain, because sometimes we look but don't see. Sometimes we see but don't understand or appreciate what we see. So slow down, take your time, and try and glean all the information you can from what you see. Another example of sight and being observant. Which province is this photo from? It's hard to tell, but if you look on the right-hand side, you see a little blue and yellow sign on the right-hand side. That should give you a clue. As far as I know, that's the only province that does that. And the answer would be Quebec. That little sign on the right-hand side is used mainly in the winter. It indicates when it's safe to pass, especially when the highway is covered with snow, which is actually, I think, is a clever idea. But the point I'm trying to make is just be observant and try and see everything you can. And sample, sample, sample. You can never take enough samples. You can never break enough rocks. I've seen Mike Tremblay, who I'm working with this summer up in Cincinnati, take all kinds of samples that I probably wouldn't have taken. But at least he can get an assay from those samples, where if I take a picture, you can't get an assay from a picture. And it might be that one assay that might be just a slightly anomalous rock that will bring you back to the area to do more checking things out. Tip number 20 is think like a rock. And what I mean by that is most topography and geographic expressions in Canada are caused by geology, differential weathering. Some things are harder or softer. For instance, if you ever see a knoll in the middle of the swamp, or a little elevated area in the middle of the swamp, there's probably a reason for it. It could be a potential keel, a silicified keel. Who knows? Maybe loaded with gold. Wayne Webster gave the example one time. He was working for Inco 30, 40 years ago, and there was a ridge in the cedar swamp. He checked it out, and there was a whole bunch of quartz veins in it. And sure enough, someone had already blasted it. And on the edges of gullies or depressions or ridges or lakes, sometimes there'll be even though the area is being eroded and depressed because the rocks are softer. If you check the edges of those depressions or swamps, there'll be some remnant rocks because they'll oftentimes stay right near the edges. They won't get eroded. And if you can think of any examples, I'd be welcome to hear about them. Tip number 21, try prospecting on a rainy day. I've driven up Highway 144 hundreds of times, but on a rainy day, especially if I'm a passenger, I've seen rocks and textures and alterations that I've never seen otherwise. A good example of what I'm trying to show is if you're logging core, on the left it's nice and dry. You can see certain things, but on the right when it's wet, you see a lot more textures and colors and different things as well. Tip number 22 is trying to be efficient and creative. This saw design with two blades is designed by my prospector friend Dan Brunne. He just used his head, so may attach a second blade to the saw. So instead of having one cut to do your channel cut, or two cuts rather, he could do it in one, which is pretty clever and intelligent. Tip number 23 is use drones. Lots of companies, for instance, Well Done Consulting out west, They'll use drones to produce elevation maps or find old trails or old pits or old roads in conjunction with other um, airborne little tools such as multispectral imagery. So anyway, consider using drones. More guys I know are using them a little bit more often. If you do take pictures, although they probably wouldn't be this high, try and take some pictures in the spring of your area. You'll have a lot more opportunity to see different structures, lineaments and faults, and even a possible folding structure on the right-hand side. Tip number 25 is use existing methods. There's lots that are around that I haven't documented. One method is rock staining using zinc sap, or you can use cobalt blue. Here's some core that's stained to show different amounts of potassium. And here's these more details on how to do the carbonate staining of rocks. Back to tip number 1 about being observant. The Hemlo area has some interesting observations. At the early stages of prospecting several decades ago, a geologist, prospector friend of mine, he found jarosite associated with many of the anomalous gold outcrops. And jarosite is a very soluble mineral, and there's the formula for it. It has potassium and iron in it. It's very soluble, and therefore it's only abundant when it's dry, and oftentimes it'll disappear after it rains. If you touch it, it's very crumbly and soft. I found when I was doing some prospecting in Wawa, there was a ledge, and I found some jarosite under the ledge, and I took some samples around it. They were anomalous in gold, and fortunately, because it was under a ledge, the jarosite stuck around and for me to observe it and sample the area. One possible explanation as to why that would be, according to my friend who notices, Bob K., he said that potassium and gold have the same ionic radii. So maybe that explains why jarosite is associated with certain anomalous gold areas. And I think as I'm winding down near the end of my talk, I'd like to say that prospectors deserve more than a Mickey. A prospector I know, he found a new gold showing for a company, which was later on stripped and drilled and reported on in the company press releases. When asked if he could at least be given a bottle for his discovery of the gold showing, he was given a Mickey, which was pretty kind of a slap in the face. But I think companies should consider stock options or even a bonus system for their field workers or even the geotechs. The mineral exploration industry requires a special breed of person who's in the field lots and puts up with a lot and being away, et cetera, et cetera. And exploration is a real team effort. Just ask the Maple Leafs or any hockey team. So it takes a team effort. And I know the managers and directors and senior guys they're important in making decisions and making things happen, but all staff play a part. I think some sort of stock option would be one possibility as well. I know one fellow, he worked for a junior company, they gave him a stock option, and when he departed later on or left later on, he had enough money to be able to buy a house. So I think our industry is used to giving options and different things like that. So I think it's something that should be really considered. I'd like to also announce or mention a prospecting tip contest I have. So if you have any tips you want to share, you want to do your own talk, that's fine. But if you'd like to share some tips, you could enter my best prospecting tips contest. Document and submit your prospecting tip before December 1st, and you'll be eligible for a free ounce of silver or a platinum pounder hammer, valued at least $75 or $100, which is actually more than the silver and more useful. So, like I said, you get a choice of an ounce of silver or one of my hammers for the best tip. It's open to any field workers working in Ontario or from Ontario or any Canadian students. So I'd really welcome some of your tips because there's lots of things I don't even know about that I'm sure you'd were pretty helpful to other people. 2 final slides to consider. keep on prospecting. Sooner or later, you'll get it right. Sometimes it's you can't see the big picture, but you just gotta keep taking showings and samples, and sooner or later it'll work out. Because sometimes we only can see so far in person or in the field or in the future. Also, this is what retired prospectors and geologists do with their old rubber boots. Thank you. If you have any questions, there's my contact information below. You can call me or email me, and I look forward to them. Again, thanks for listening.